Hi there. So my dad lives in Littleton, North Carolina. This is a picture of him. Littleton, North Carolina, if you don't know, is a little town in North Carolina. It's in the rural South. My parents divorced when I was 3, and every other weekend my dad would travel 2 hours to pick me up, 2 hours back, and then again to drop me off. 2 hours, 2 hours. He was never even a minute late. My dad is the only man on either side of my family that can cook, and he raised 2 girls that are now strong and ambitious women. This is my sister, valedictorian at NC State University, and now just finished her first year at medical school. My dad voted for Trump, y'all. During the election, when the Pussygate story broke, and we at Hollaback were getting phone calls from reporters left and right and front and center for comment, what was this gonna mean? I texted my sister and I said, Dad's not still voting for Trump, is he? And she texted back, yeah, he is. And it was in that moment, long before the election results rolled in, when we all still thought Hillary was gonna win, that I realized the impact of trauma wasn't gonna end with this campaign. Because maybe this wasn't just about politics or who our next president was gonna be. Maybe those were just symptoms. And maybe this was about us somehow. My dad voted for Trump enthusiastically. I voted for Hillary enthusiastically. This is the truth, but it's also a representation of the wide distance between us. And I love my dad so deeply. There's never been a moment in my life where I questioned his love for me. But at times, this relationship is so hard, it feels almost impossible. Does anyone out there have somebody that they're thinking about right now? A similar relationship, a friend, a family member? Yeah. 15% of people in this country no longer speak to family members as a result of this election. It was actually 13% right when the election happened, and it's 15% as of January, and it's probably just getting worse. And we are a nation grieving what we've lost. We are a nation that's actively losing each other. But we're also a nation who's never really had each other's backs to begin with. These divisions between us have always been there, and sometimes they feel like they're getting a little bit smaller. But right now, they're feeling like they're getting even bigger. When I was 18, I dyed my hair red. I also moved from the South to big old New York City to go right here at NYU. And on my first day of class, I was walking through Washington Square Park, beautiful Washington Square Park, and a man said, "Hello, baby," to me. And I said, "Hello." And he responded, "I want to fuck the shit out of you." And so I pretended like it didn't happen, because he was literally one man out of 8 million people. But it happened again, and it happened again. 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day. I would get this range of lewd sexual comments. Things like, "I'd rape her," or, "Are you a girl or a boy?" I never talked about street harassment before I started Hollaback. But one day I was talking to my friend Kimberly, and she was talking about her experiences with harassment. And she said, "When I get harassed, I never know if it's because I'm a woman, or because I'm gay, or because I'm Latina." And I felt in the vibrations of her voice when she said that, in the resonance of her heart, I felt that pain, that depth and that breadth of that pain. And look, I'd read Audre Lorde, I'd read Judith Butler, I have a frickin' undergraduate degree in the intersections between race, gender, sexuality, and class. But the practice for caring for others is a matter of the heart, not the head. And just because my brain deeply understood with lots of citations that the cost for being black and being gay and being trans, being an immigrant, being Muslim, being disabled is much, much steeper for others than the cost it is for me of simply being a white woman. And it took a story, not an academic book, for me to throw down and to start an organization to start to address harassment. The more stories that I heard, the more stories that Hollaback collected, the more visible and the more complicated and the more hard this conversation became. This is Paige Lily Montlell Phillips. She lives in London. When she ignored unwanted advances on the street, a man mowed her over in his moped. She had internal bleeding, and he was let go by the police within 2 hours. And this is Mary Unique Spears, who was leaving a funeral with her 3 children when a man asked her for her number. She said, "No, I have a fiancé." And he shot her in the head right then and there. Through story, the costs we pay to be who we are start to become scripted onto our hearts. And as these stories of these 2 amazing women start to become scripted onto yours, let's take a second to breathe and remember. Because I'm going to talk a little bit today about bridging difference, but we can't talk about that unless we talk about what really divides us. We can't see what connects us until we're really willing to fully see each other's pain. We've collected 11,000 stories of harassment through Hollaback. We usually get about over 100 a month, but since the election, that rate of reports has doubled. How many people here have ever been grabbed in the crotch, non-consensually? You folks? Yeah. And how many people know somebody who's been grabbed in the crotch, non-consensually? Yeah. So for me, for many of you in this room, grabbing women by the pussies is a real thing. A story I've heard from hundreds of women and trans men and gender nonconforming folks from all over the world. But I think for most of America, this story wasn't real. It was easy to dismiss because they'd never heard of it happening. It was easy to dismiss because maybe it had happened to them, but they thought that they were the only one and that it was probably their fault. And that's why Hollaback has entered into this work of bridge building to begin with, because we know how stories shape empathy, and we know how empathy builds community. And we've learned what it looks like to live in trauma at an everyday, inescapable scale. But what I didn't know a lot about was grief. And even before this election happened, all I could feel from my community, from my people, was grief. It was everywhere. And so I called Lennon Flowers, who's the executive director of the Dinner Party, a community of 20 and 30-somethings processing traumatic loss. And we called Jen Bailey, executive director of the Faith Matters Network, a faith-rooted social justice leadership incubator working in the South, led by people of color. And we started this experiment. We had this idea that we were going to bring people together so that we could make sense of ourselves in the wake of the election in the context of a world that hated us so that we could survive. But we also had this other idea, that we wanted to have conversations to bridge difference, like the space between my dad and I, and we wanted to do it over the one thing that everyone loves, food. We gave people resources and training so that anybody could do it in their home, and the project took off. We called it 100 days, 100 dinners, because we couldn't see past the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. And we aimed to have 100 dinners on the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, but it was so successful that we kept it going, and now it's called the People's Supper. So here's the thing. The #1 indicator for somebody who voted for Trump is agreement with the following phrase. And this is a phrase. This is not a racial identity. This is not a location in America. This is a phrase. People like me don't have any say. I'm going to repeat that one again because I want you guys to hear it. People like me don't have any say. Think a second for the demographics of who voted for Trump. Now raise your hand if when you hear the phrase, people like me don't have any say, you get a little confused and pretty damn pissed off. Yeah, me too. Me too. And my dad feels that way a lot, right? He lives in the 3rd poorest county in the United States. He calls politicians a bunch of crooks. And when the power lines go down in his neighborhood, they can be down for days. We're living in what's been termed the age of loneliness. We're more connected than ever before, but we're also more isolated. We've got these wide but thin nets on social media, and a lot of us have increasingly few people to actually lean on. In 1985, 1 in 10 Americans said they had no one they could talk to about important matters, no one. By 2004, that figure had jumped to 1 in 4. And my guess is it's still on the rise. And yeah, all right, I'll give it to you. Maybe we can't agree on a damn thing. And maybe we've all had moments in which we've been treated as less than. And we've all had a moment where we've thought, people don't listen to people like me. And we've all had moments when we felt shamed and blamed, not for who we actually were, but for what we represented. And maybe it was an assumption about being young, or being gay, or living in the country instead of the city, or being Muslim, or being black, or having an accent, or being poor, or watching Fox. But when we shame others for membership of a group versus spending the time to actually get to know them, we risk reinforcing this cycle of pain and polarization and loneliness. My dad knows that you all think that you're better than him. And that's okay. Because you're all a bunch of Yankees who paid too much for college and way too much for rent. You were smart enough to get a job in the technology sector, but you weren't smart enough to get a job that could actually pay you well. You're more concerned about being politically correct than you are with the people who are actually struggling to make ends meet. How many of those do you know? This shame and blame cycle only drives us further apart. What will it take to actually break it? This isn't the first time that we've been asking this at Hollaback, and we've been chewing on how to disrupt this cycle of shame and blame and assumptions and all that loneliness and isolation that comes with it for quite some time. We've been training people in how to intervene when they see harassment happening, to tell those stories and to map them. And now, post-election, we've trained over 1,700 people how to intervene. And now, through the rest of the summer, we're offering free webinars open to the public for folks that want to learn how to take care of each other better. Last year, we launched Heart Mob with the same ideas in mind, but this time related to online harassment. People can share their experience of online harassment, and if they need help, ask for it. We're a vetted community of volunteers. We've discovered in this process that the core problem is a relationship problem. And yes, it's a relationship problem that is absolutely grounded in long histories of racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism, but it is a relationship problem nonetheless. And relationships are very, very hard. The People's Supper has challenged every piece of my being. And I have struggled, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes nervously, to figure out how to sit down next to somebody who doesn't think that I deserve basic human rights, who doesn't think that I deserve basic control over my body, basic protection from violence, and to hold them in their full dignity, to fully see and hear them for who they are. This is real, and it's personal work. And this is not for the purpose of me somehow merging my beliefs with theirs. Oh, hell no. And this is not to tamp down my absolutely righteous rage for what is happening in our country right now. This is for the sake of seeing them as people. This is for the sake of disrupting that cycle of shame and blame. Because here's the question that I'm holding. Can I really ask somebody to see me in my full dignity when I'm unwilling to hold them in theirs? All in all, we've heard from people in 299 cities and towns. We've had 175 dinners. We're aiming for 750, and I hope that you'll join me by signing up to host one. So, when everything hurts, is healing really possible? Probably not. No, probably not really. But growth is. And our research with Beth Livingston from Cornell University showed that even as little as a knowing glance can reduce trauma. And our research with Jill Diamond of Georgia Tech showed that by telling your story and bearing witness of your pain to others, you can move that story from something that was terrible that happened to you to something that's actually not about you, but about the messed up world that we live in. And that then inspires people to take action. That then fuels the resistance. My dad is coming to visit tomorrow with my sister and my stepmother. I've lived in New York City for 18 years. He's come to visit me about 5 times, but I've got a 1.5-year-old now, and he is really committed to this grandfather scene. It's adorable. I'm going to cook for him, and we're going to do what families do best. We're going to tell some stories. And at the People's Supper, we ask, when was the first time you understood the concept of citizenship? So, Dad, why was our family so eager to escape that we were among the first to come through Jamestown? And at the People's Supper, we ask, what is a moment in which you've been treated as less than? So, Dad, were you ever bullied as a kid for being named Bland? My dad's name is literally Bland. Whenever he describes it, he says, like food that doesn't taste good. And at the People's Supper, we ask, what is a moment in which you felt truly seen and truly heard? So, Dad, have you ever thought the government listened to you? How? Why? One of my mentors, LaWanda Thompson, recently reminded me that my dad is my greatest teacher. She said, if I can learn to hold my dad close and to hold space for conflict and hurt and pain in there, then I will learn and I will understand what it means to fully and deeply see somebody. I think our stories are a lot more complicated than our votes or our politics would have us to believe. I think that they can shape and reshape us, and in doing so, shape the contours of our collective selves. I think the movement of our time isn't a movement against Donald Trump. I think it's a movement for each other. When love is an act of resistance, we can't give up. Thank you.
Thank you.